From the University of Otago, friend of the show, Robert Patman. Robert, thank you very much for coming back to the show. We appreciate you giving us some time. Yes, lovely to have you. Look, what I thought we'd do to start this off is I want to do a little bit of a setup as to some stuff around Taiwan, because it's something that's always interested me. You know, politicians aren't allowed to talk about Taiwan. They're not allowed to talk about Tibet. There's these things that are kind of things they're not supposed to talk about. I sort of understand why, but it would be good to get your perspective on that from an academic point of view. And I want to speak to that a little bit by showing some footage of a podcast I did with James Shaw not too long ago. You can tell it's a bit of a long ago because in this footage here, I don't have my there's no shelf behind me, but now there's a shelf. So you can see there's a shelf, no shelf, no. And I just asked him the question. I was like, what's up with Taiwan? Can you talk about look, that's actually the name of the thing. What's up with Taiwan? You know, can you talk about it? What is Taiwan to us? What should Taiwan be to us? And this is what Minister Shaw had to say.
Well, we would say that everybody on Earth has the right to self-determination. So that's not really a question for me. It's really for the people of Taiwan to determine for themselves.
Yeah, sorry. So the direct question was, should it be a country? Should they have independence? That was the direct question.
I mean, you know, I'm not kind of remotely qualified to put words into their mouths. So that would be the stance that we would take.
So look, honestly, I'm not trying to be a cheeky bastard here, but does that mean you can't really answer the question? Like you can't actually say they should be a country because of our relationship with China?
Well, I have responsibilities as a government minister. I have to kind of represent the views of the government, and especially when it comes to matters of foreign relations, right? So, you know, there's that. But I guess my point is, I don't, you know, putting my ministerial hat to one side for a second, I don't consider it, you know, my, you know, I don't think that I should take a view about whether Taiwan should or should not be a country. That's not for me to say, right? My point is that, you know, certainly in the Green Party's view, that people, you know, should have a right to determine for themselves, you know, what kind of governance arrangements they want for themselves. I mean, that's kind of what we would call appropriate decision making in our parlance. You know, that the people who are affected by a decision should participate in those decisions that affect them.
Now, on some level, I feel like that's kind of, and I be careful with my language here. I don't want to call James Shaw a coward, but sort of a coward's way out. It's a little bit, to me, it feels a little bit like saying, well, you know, if the abused wife, it's really up to her. Who am I to say whether she should or shouldn't leave her abuser? You know, I'm not going to take a position. That's really up to her to decide what she wants to do. It does feel a little bit like that. But based on that, I've done some research, and James Shaw was kind of saying, well, it's up to the people of Taiwan. Research is pretty clear that the people of Taiwan both want independence, and 76% of them already think they have independence because of how they're living currently, not necessarily under China. So the people of Taiwan actually sort of feel like they are already independent. And if they're not aware of that, obviously that would mean they want independence, which comes out in a bunch of research that's been done. Basically, all the research up here that is around the 30% of respondents marker, all has to do with either maintaining the status quo, which is they think they have independence and decide at a later date, or being independent. The only anomaly to this is there's one down here that's at about 5%, which is independence as soon as possible. Now, in this obviously quite detailed graph, independence as soon as possible ranks quite lowly, along with all the ones to do with unification. But I think that possibly could reflect the fact that many of these people already think they are independent. So following on from what James Shaw said about it's about the people of Taiwan to decide, it seems they've decided because they already think they are independent or they want independence. So I guess as a government, I'd like our government to kind of support the people of Taiwan in that. Now, that big long-winded setup, Robert, I want to talk to you about sort of what's happening now with Nancy Pelosi landing there, who and what is Taiwan to us and to China, and what it means, I guess, for the world political scene.
Well, Nancy Pelosi's visit, in a sense, reflects growing apprehensions about China's policy to Taiwan following China's public support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's difficult to divorce the Ukraine conflict from the situation that's unfolding now in Asia with respect to China and Taiwan, because
Right.
when Xi Jinping made that outrageous statement that China believed Putin had legitimate security concerns that basically justified the invasion,
Right.
that was a real fork in the road moment. And I think there is quite significant differences of view in Beijing. I don't think that view is uniformly held by the Chinese leadership. And it's led to some commentaries, such as Fareed Zakaria, who works for CNN, saying
Yep.
that the best strategy to deal with China is to defeat Russia in Ukraine. That is, that if Mr. Putin's attempt to annex and occupy Ukraine fails, that will be a defeat for Xi.
Right.
It will also act as a cautionary tale for any hardliners in Beijing thinking about using military force against Taiwan. Now, we as a country have been absolutely, after a tentative start, we've been quite supportive of efforts to resist Putin's invasion. So although we have excellent relations with China, particularly in the economic sphere, we've spent more than 38 million New Zealand dollars, that's probably a conservative estimate, in military and humanitarian assistance to a country which is resisting an ally of China, which is Russia. So we do have conflicts of interest with China, and this is a big one at the
Yeah.
moment. When we talk about China, we're talking about Xi Jinping's leadership. But you asked me the supplementary question: what's our relationship with China and Taiwan? I think I've already mentioned that we've managed to maintain a close relationship with both superpowers. That's come under strain because of Chinese assertiveness to some degree, and also now because of its support of Putin's outrageous attempt to build a greater Russia at the expense of a democratic neighbor that pursues a non-nuclear policy, which of course we fully agree with.
Yeah.
It's not, we didn't create that situation, China did. So now it has to deal with the consequences of that. And, you know, I think the government has, through its messaging and signaling, it's refused to pigeonhole China with Russia. But in doing so, and particularly by supporting efforts to eject Russian troops from Ukraine, it has signaled to China that we have fundamental differences with them on this issue.
Mm.
And I think Jacinda Ardern's been absolutely, as have the foreign minister, Nanaia Mahuta, absolutely clear on this. A liberal democracy is not going to roll over and become become the junior player in a sort of master-servant relationship because we need business with China. China, by the way, is very vulnerable globally on the business front because its whole rise to superpower status, Pat, is based on access to the world capitalist market, particularly
Right.
three markets: US, Japan, and the EU. So China, if it does pursue a military option in Taiwan, could put all that at risk, which in turn could undermine the political legitimacy of the Communist Party, because the legitimacy of the Communist Party of China, ironically, rests on fruitful trade relations with many capitalist countries. So there's a lot at stake here, and I think that's why there was some unease in Beijing when Xi Jinping stuck his neck out and said that Putin's actions in Ukraine were legitimate. What's our relationship with Taiwan? Very good.
Yeah.
Like the United States, we don't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, but we have about everything else. Very good people-to-people relations, excellent economic relations, and strong political ties because of the president despite attempts by the mainland China, the Communist Party of China, to interfere in the 2016 election in favour of the opposition candidate, nevertheless, the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, prevailed. And she is a woman and relatively young, and like our prime minister, so there's a certain degree of solidarity there. And I think Taiwan has demonstrated it's a self-governed, thriving democracy. Having said that, there's a one China policy being pursued by the United States, which recognizes that Taiwan and China are inextricably linked, and that Taiwan, is part of China. Having said that, the Americans, it's an ambiguous policy. The Americans also recognize that Taiwan has a core right to self-govern.
Right.
And it does so on a democratic basis. And some of the contradictions and ambiguities of this policy are now being exposed as China's become more assertive. So we, I think, as a country, can pursue a reasonably nuanced policy, and we have been. But a lot will depend on how assertive China becomes.
Yeah,
I think we've already signaled to China indirectly that we're not prepared to roll over on core values like respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that's why we supported the Ukrainian government. But we've tried to have it both ways. We've signaled that we disagree with China in relation to the Ukraine, but we've also refused to put China in the same camp as Russia.
Right.
So it is a nuanced position, and it's intended that in this way, we can somehow navigate a situation in which many Western countries find themselves at odds with both Russia and China.
Firstly, I was going to say, just for people who don't know, the sunset behind your head in Dunedin looks fantastic at the moment. You have a glow around you, you have a halo around you, Robert. That looks amazing. I was wondering, is one of the differences between Russia and China that Putin really doesn't care about a scorched earth principle? He will burn it all down and leave nothing behind. But with China, are they just therefore saber rattling when they threaten military action if America visits, because they're aware that if they do that, then they obviously potentially suffer the ill effects of losing financial relationships with those three main regions that you talk about? Or, so I guess what I'm saying is, does China have enough nous about them to go, actually, we can make a lot of noise, but if we actually make that move, it's going to be more detrimental to us than it would be beneficial of gaining Taiwan back, where it feels like Putin's just gone, let's burn it all down. I've got cancer. I'm on my way out. I'm going to burn it all down. Is there a difference between those two countries, do you think?
So, but as I say, I do think there is differences within the Chinese leadership. And at the moment, the person who's the paramount leader is calling the shots. But he will pay a big price if he gets it wrong over Russia.
Yeah.
What I would say is that a lot of people put Russia and China together. They have a tactical mutual interest in opposing the United States' dominance in the world, and particularly NATO dominance. They're both authoritarian one-party states. But Russia is in a completely different situation to China. Russia's state capitalism has not been as successful as China's form of economy.
Right.
China is legitimately the second biggest economy to the United States in the world, and probably growing. And the Chinese privately have contempt for the Russian economic system.
Right.
Russia's got an economy smaller than Italy's. It's 11th in the world. It's a wannabe. It wants to be a great power. It wants to be a superpower. But I'm afraid its army have been severely and somewhat surprisingly embarrassed by the staunch resistance of the Ukrainians and the incompetence of their combination of conscripts and professional soldiers in Ukraine. So I don't think China's going to die in a ditch over Russia, but they, like many authoritarian states, I think Xi and Putin have miscalculated with respect to the Western reaction.
Okay.
Putin thought, having invested highly in supporting populist leaders like Boris Johnson and Trump and Bolsonaro, Urban, that the West wouldn't be able to get its act together in the face of what he said was rightfully his in Ukraine. I mean, so, and I think, in a sense, China, or at least Xi and his close circle, may have bought in to the misperception that Putin was harboring, that the West, the failing West, as both China and Russia has described the Western world, and they've been actually quite shocked by what has been quite a robust response by many Western countries, not all, but many.
Mm.
And so I don't buy the idea, and I think the Prime Minister's right not to pigeonhole Russia and China together. I think their relationship is a marriage of convenience. They
Right.
perceive that they both have an interest in ensuring that America doesn't dominate the world too much.
It's a little bit of that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if
Yeah,
they both hate America, then they'll get together on their disdain for America as opposed to anything else.
but she may be beginning to discover that in an interconnected world, and in a world in which China's well-being is linked to access to the world capitalist economy, there
Yep.
may be limits to how far you can push that. Remember, Putin and Xi Jinping got together just before. It was at the time of the Olympics, and in early February, it was mid-February, I think, when Putin went to China and apparently got the green light for the invasion of Ukraine, and they put together this very long statement about an alliance without limits. Well, it's interesting because rhetorically that may be true, and Xi Jinping, has surprised many people by coming out by saying that Putin's outrageous land grab in Ukraine is legitimate.
Wow.
But you have to read the small print as well. China has not given, as far as we know, according to most American commentators, and not just commentators, Jake Sullivan, Mr. Biden's national security advisor, has said they have been watching the Chinese very carefully. And as far as they can see, China is very concerned about doing anything that would invoke sanctions against itself, because the Americans warned them, if they start really supporting the Chinese militarily, they can expect economic sanctions. And so it's interesting, he's talked tough in support of Russia, but actually hasn't done too much. And apparently when Lavrov went over there shopping for missiles, it was given short shrift. So, it's an interestingly nuanced situation. And in that sense, I think New Zealand's position, not to assume that China is necessarily in Putin's camp. I mean, for
Right.
one thing, China perceives Putin as a junior partner, so it's not going to be taking any orders from Moscow. So that's one thing. They do share an interest in trying to thwart NATO and American dominance as they see it. But it's a finely balanced situation at the moment. I think quite a lot rests in relation to China and Taiwan on the outcome of the war, the conflict in Ukraine.
That's really interesting. Look, just to come right back to the full circle and just ask a very simple question, because from the outside looking in, it looks like the Americans, or Nancy Pelosi in particular, is just basically making this trip to thumb her nose at China. That may or may not be correct on some level, but why would you say Nancy Pelosi has gone to Taiwan? What's the reason for her stopping down and doing this diplomatic trip?
Well, first of all, she has been a long-term critic of China. She visited China back in the early 90s after Tiananmen Square and expressed solidarity with those who were the victims of Tiananmen Square. That was the massacre of something like close to 3,000 students. She has been a long-term critic of Chinese policy towards the Uyghurs, the Muslim minority within China. She's been a long-term supporter of the protesters in Hong Kong. And she's been a long-term backer of Taiwan. So, in a sense, from China's perspective, her presence is particularly unwelcome. Why has Nancy Pelosi done this, knowing all this? I think from her point of view, it's good politics. You've got the midterms coming up. This is an
Right.
issue that unifies the Republicans and the Democrats.
Yeah, it has.
And gives the government some much needed brownie points, because let's face it, Biden's been floundering in the polls,
Hmm.
and their support for the Ukraine, which I think is generally commendable and the right thing to do, is not getting overwhelming support in the United States. Supporting the victim of aggression doesn't seem to have captured the sort of unified support that seems to be available when a politician takes a stand against China.
Yeah, right.
So Pelosi's been praised by Republicans, you probably noticed, Pat. So
Yep.
I think politics has got a bit to do with it. I think there's another issue here, though. Given Pelosi's personal interest in criticizing what she's seen as Chinese authoritarianism going over decades, I think she really perceives, in light of the Putin invasion of Ukraine, this is a time to stand shoulder to shoulder with a democracy that's under threat. And I think that she wrote an opinion piece in the Washington Post in the last 24 hours, which was published shortly before she got into Taiwan, arrived to Taiwan. And in the opinion piece, she said the world is now facing a confrontation between autocracy and democracy. And she said that America will stand, shoulder to shoulder with democracy. So I think there's that sort of political symbolism. And I think it's also a warning to China. Although Biden didn't approve of this, he also said he didn't approve of Nancy Pelosi's visit. He also said she had a perfect right to go,
Yeah.
which of course
Yeah.
reflects separation of powers in the American system.
There have
Of
been a
course,
few headlines saying
yeah, that way.
there have been a few headlines saying this could be a bit of a headache to Biden, but that's
Oh, yeah.
interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah. Hey, Robert, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for adding some well-researched and educated context to our conversations we have here on BHN. And thank you for your thoughts tonight about what's happening in Taiwan. And I guess we shall just wait and see whether China has been saber rattling, or if actually worse is yet to come from them militarily.
Well, the good news is, Pat, I think, is that Nancy Pelosi's visit will soon be over, which might diffuse the situation and therefore prevent the situation escalating to a sort of 1995 scenario where US warships went to the Taiwan Strait. So hopefully the crisis, I think China will feel they must make some sort of protest, and then there'll probably be, there are military exercises going on and military drills. But hopefully it won't reach the level of the 1995 confrontation.
Professor Robert Patman from the University of Otago. Robert, thanks for joining us again today.
Thanks, Pat. Pleasure.